And we're going to ask our speakers to please briefly present themselves and position their work in relation to the field of urban politics, how they understand it, how they relate to it, and tell us why they think investigating questions that relate to the city and the built environment matter to the studies of power and politics more broadly, or vice versa, depending on where you want to enter from. So, Sarah, تفضلي, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you, Ahmed and the APSN network for this invitation and the Beirut Urban Lab. Really excited to be here amongst some of my favorite scholars in this field. So it feels like quite a privilege. All right, so Mona's already kind of given you a sense of the two projects that kind of how I've put a lot of work and time into recently. I guess I'll just maybe talk a little bit more about what the book has been doing. So basically, as Mona said, it's forthcoming with Duke sometime, hopefully spring, summer of 2023. And the idea there was to examine the politics of neoliberalism through the lens of a multi-sited ethnography in 6 neighborhoods undergoing transformation in Cairo and Istanbul. And it mostly focuses on projects that were ongoing in the 2000s. And the main kind of, speaking of positioning the work, the main idea here is to open up how we talk about political economy, how we think about market making, how we kind of think about the intersections of the making of markets, but also the politics of expertise, science. Mona mentioned that I kind of trained in science and technology studies as well. So this is pretty important for me to kind of put these things together and think about how it transforms our experience of the political, really, at the end of the day. And when Mona asked sort of, how do we come, why is it important to look at this through, look at the power and politics through the lens of the city? For me, there's no kind of, it just seems so obvious, and there's kind of no other way to do it. No, I mean, definitely other ways, but I mean, basically, I read Eyal Weizman's book as a master's student when it was still kind of the work on politics of verticality. And here I'm dating myself a little bit. And it's just, you see the dynamics of how he talks about how kind of infrastructural projects come together, how the making of the urban built environment produces settler colonial dynamics that are impossible to unsee, right? The minute you kind of see how these built environmental transformations are shaping the political in very powerful ways, no matter how much my graduate training tried to shake it off of me, it was impossible. And then kind of my pathway to really kind of giving the space to the spatial, material, and affective experiences of the city as kind of the core of where I see the production of the political economic and the political or the polity as we kind of know it. And the second book kind of takes similar interests, but moves in a slightly different direction. And so rather than centering on the city as a space where I'm going to see these spatial, material, affective experiences, I decided to follow digital infrastructures across the global south, and especially the cloud, as it kind of transforms the world as we know it, how we see it, how we perceived it, but also the geographies of connection of the political in across and I'm focusing on the Middle East and Africa, and the interesting thing and the kind of challenge here for me methodologically is I'm really interested in looking at connection here, right? My first project was very much a place-based project, 6 neighborhoods in which I was very much embedded during the ethnography, and now to follow a particular object that is the cloud and the political that is forming around it, but also maintain an ethnographic sensibility is kind of what I'm hoping to achieve, but also finding an interesting challenge. So I'll leave it here as an introduction into the kind of work that I'm doing, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Sarah. Fascinating. We want to know so much more, but I'm going to defer to Omar to build on this or to depart from this, depending how he'd like to do it. Tfaddal, Omar.
Thank you, Mona, very much. And thank you to the APSN for this generous invitation. It is pretty humbling to be in conversation with Mona, Sarah, and Rafif today, whose work I continue to learn from. So my research over the last few years has centered around 3 themes or areas: securitization, the city, and the state. My book project, which grew out of my doctoral dissertation, is an ethnography of security checkpoints in contemporary Baghdad. Checkpoints became ubiquitous in Baghdad in the wake of the US and UK-led invasion and occupation of Iraq nearly 2 decades ago. They were set up and operated by the US military, and their control was slowly transitioned to Iraqi authorities and security institutions, primarily Baghdad Operations Command, an institution that was established in late 2006. And while most of the many checkpoints have slowly been removed over the last few years, many do still remain. What led me to the checkpoint as a kind of focus of research was not so much traditional questions about civil war and political violence, such as how and why civil wars begin, or when and why people switch allegiances during such events, which have been, a key kind of focus of political science literature. Rather, the checkpoint becomes my object of study in large part because of how they are lived. Despite hundreds of checkpoints kind of pockmarking Baghdad's streetscapes, most of the city's residents have lamented them as wholly incapable of providing urban security. They point to both spectacular and mundane forms of insecurity and violence as proof of their, quote unquote, ineffectiveness. So part of what I argue is even while struggling to produce security across the capital city, these checkpoints remain integral to helping produce state authority, or the state kind of as we know it. And so I guess 2 kind of direct answers to this first question. First, in my work, the city and the people and things that help comprise it become an entry point in determining the ways in which political authority comes to be, even when it lets us down over and over again. How and why does it still form under such conditions? And second, as much as I look at a specific security architecture, the checkpoint, in a discrete city, Baghdad, investigating urban space and materials helps us see the limits of delimits. That is, the need to push back on the idea that the checkpoint and the city are circumscribed sites and spaces. In this way, I move away from thinking topographically, such as by deploying scale as a unit of analysis. I instead try to explore conditions more relationally or topologically, to explore how a range of social forces inside and outside a city ultimately work across spaces and geographies. In other words, spatial entanglements produce and are produced by modes of governance that are not so much bounded by lines on a map, but instead sometimes form through the blurredness of those lines or their altogether erasure. And I'll leave it there for now. I want to thank you.
That's very inspiring. Thank you, Omar. Very insightful. Rafif, your turn.
Thank you very much, Mona. And of course, thanks to the APSN and to the Beirut Urban Lab for putting us all in conversation. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with Omar, Sarah, and Mona. My work has largely focused on the politics of transport infrastructures and logistics chains. So I look at things like maritime ports, roads, rail, airports, and logistics cities as they are transforming the economic geography of the MENA region more broadly. Although there's an increasing interest in looking at infrastructures, what some have even called the infrastructural turn, I would say this work is much more advanced in the field of geography and anthropology than it has been in politics. And what I'm really hoping to do is push this further in centering infrastructures and how we can understand the political, the built environment, and how logistics is reshaping the connections within the Middle East region, but also trans-regionally with other regions. My main focus has been on the Gulf Cooperation Council, tracing what the United Arab Emirates has been doing in expanding its logistics space, both nationally, regionally, and transnationally. Much of this work was inspired by Ahmed Qana's now classic City as Corporation. I think many of us are building on that work of looking at the city as corporation, but seeing how it functions in different spheres. There has also been interesting work in political economy, trying to push beyond the rentier state theory. For a very long time, when it came to understanding the Gulf Cooperation Council, rentier state theory was the only prism by which we understood it. There was only a focus on oil. Some have even said a fetishism of oil. And I think there's been a new generation of research that has really pushed against that in trying to understand the GCC beyond only oil and to look at these logistics change and how they are reshaping space. Within infrastructure studies, there is a big focus on black boxing. The idea that we normally don't understand how infrastructures work, except for when they fail. And when you look at waves of contestation in the Middle East recently, many of them have actually been around infrastructural failure, whether it's electricity, access to water, etc. So I think in trying to understand the political, centering infrastructures, who has access to them, how they function within a city is really crucially important. Maritime infrastructure in particular, I think is playing a significant role nowadays in international relations. If we think about what some have called the infrastructural scramble going on, especially for infrastructure within the African continent, here thinking about networks like the One Belt, One Road, or the United Arab Emirates investing extensively in maritime ports across the Horn of Africa, we see how these infrastructures are reshaping international relations and reshaping connections between states. But importantly, they're also reshaping cities. Cities are being remade in the interest of trade, market-led development, rather for the interest of the residents who live within them. So one of the things I try to trace is these new infrastructures and even entirely new cities that are being made for the purpose of logistics. One of the innovations in Dubai, for example, has been something called the Logistics City, which is a city entirely made for the purpose of logistics that sits alongside a port. A lot of these experiments in this type of logistics are actually happening within our region, and I think deserve a lot deeper study. Two of the things I focus on when I look at this is the increasing intersection between these infrastructures of trade, aid, and militarism. Some of these infrastructures are for trade on face value, but many of them actually cohered around the war on Iraq, with the logistics chains that happened at that time, needing these big maritime ports for the US military in the region. So there is a major overlap in the infrastructures of trade and militarism. More recently, because our region is having one of the largest so-called humanitarian disasters, one of the largest phases of displacement since World War II, humanitarianism also plays a large role. So we are seeing an intersection between these infrastructures of trade and infrastructures of humanitarianism. So alongside Dubai Logistics City, we also have something called Dubai Humanitarian City, which I can speak about extensively later. So there is a tracing here to be done and a mapping around the intersections of trade, aid, and militarism. One question I'm particularly interested in is the question of labor. The labor of constructing these so-called cities, the labor of building these ports. Where is it coming from? How is it being treated? And here, again, we see an intersection with militarism. It's largely the same chains that were used to bring logistical labor for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that are being used to create these hubs and these new networks of logistics. So that's in a nutshell what I try to look at.